Welcome to the Feehery Theory Podcast, brought to you by EFB Advocacy. EFB means excellent for business. I'm joined by my colleagues Adam Belmar, Jon Easton, and special guest Jon Ward. Jon is a columnist for Yahoo News, a soon-to-be best-selling author, a Capitol Hill denizen, a father of five, a Little League baseball coach, and I think one of the most compelling political writers out there.
Get that on tape.
It's on tape. Jon, welcome to EFB.
Thank you, Jon. Good to be here.
Theory 1, defender of the faith. The religious right's love affair with Donald Trump will soon be put to the test in Alabama, where his endorsed candidate, Luther Strange, is running a primary against Roy Moore, a biblical conservative who became famous for defying the Supreme Court's order to take down a display of the Ten Commandments from his courtroom when he was a judge. My theory: all politics is local, and Luther Strange will win or lose, not because of anything Donald Trump does or says, but instead because of the particular dynamics in the state. That being said, the religious right's embrace of Donald Trump has confounded many people, including our guest today. Jon, why do you think Christian conservatives love Donald Trump so much?
Well, it's a blunt question, and I'll be blunt in response. I think it's because they're scared. I think they're scared of changing culture. They're scared of changing demographics. And I think culture and demographics are the two reasons why they're scared. And I think they've reacted out of fear and chosen a guy who they feel like, they're not simpatico on a lot of things, but he's their bully.
Yeah, I think about in the context of King Henry VIII. And King Henry VIII was appointed by Pope Leo as the defender of the faith, even though he, even before he killed his 7 wives or whatever he did, he was not really much of a strong moral character.
Yeah.
Trump is someone who speaks out in favor of the Christian religion, also speaks out in favor of things that a lot of Christian conservatives believe, even though in his personal life it's not particularly moral. In this race in Alabama, you've got Roy Moore versus Luther Strange. Roy is seen as this big Christian. He's beloved by the religious right. He's also the anti-establishment figure. How do you think that Trump's going to play down there in the Alabama race?
Before I answer that, I just want to add to what your previous question. I want to preface my assertion with a qualification, which would be to say I don't question the sincerity of the faith of a lot of people who support Trump, who are evangelicals, but I do think that a lot of the support for him and the sort of marriage of the religious right with his populism, I think people like more. I think what is driving that is a confusion of sincere, authentic faith and sort of a form of the faith that's more cultural and like a civil religion. There's just a mishmashing of and a confusion of, what is the realm, what does Christianity look like in real life, and how much should it extend into politics, and how do Christians live out their faith in a country that's increasingly secular and multicultural and multi-ethnic. So that's a lot of words and a lot of big words. But how is he going to do in Alabama? I actually trust your take on this more because I've been more focused on Virginia, the governor's race there, and I've been focused on some other profiles, the piece on Ja'Marr Tisby that I wrote. So I don't have a lot of insider thoughts on Alabama. I'm as curious as anybody to find out what happens. I'm particularly interested by Steve Bannon's move to play there. They, to me, got involved there because they thought it looked like an easy win, and I think it's been interesting to watch Trump get pulled in on the other side by people in the White House, and I think probably by McConnell. So I'm interested to see what happens in terms of Bannon's influence and Breitbart's influence. Since I kind of see them as cancerous, I'd like to see them get rebuked, but we'll see.
So, Jon Easton, you are our local Senate expert. You've been in contact with the leader's office and other folks in the political world. You watched at least excerpts of the debate last night. You kind of read up on this. What are your thoughts on what's going on in Alabama?
Well, for anybody who loves politics, I think that to watch a debate, especially a Senate debate, where things can get less scripted, and they can, especially this debate where there was no moderator. They literally questioned each other. It was billed as a bit of a Lincoln Douglas debate. The coverage suggested it was anything but. But
there's no Lincoln in that debate.
no, and as somebody who has a former campaign staffer as well, I can tell you I shudder when I see debates because I know how much effort is put into it, how many the butterflies that are going throughout everybody involved, because they can be so unpredictable, so unwieldy, and they can be very damaging. They'll hurt somebody, but not necessarily help somebody. Last night, to your point earlier, John, I do think this race is tightening. It was Moore's for a while, a big lead. It's tightening in part, I think, because of all of the advertising and Strange's on his behalf, but also President Trump's help. He is the leader of the party. He doesn't like to admit it sometimes, but he is the leader of the party. He is helping him. If this is close, I do believe President Trump makes the difference. I was really entertained by this article covering the debate this morning from the Alabama and the Birmingham paper. It said that Luther Strange reacted to Roy Moore's contention that God is in this race. And so he was, every time he could, he tried to bring God into it in his favor.
Who did?
Roy Moore did.
Yeah, right.
So Luther Strange says, and this is why debates are so fantastic. Luther Strange says, with all due respect, I don't think God is on your side. I don't think God is on my side. But one thing I know is the president is on my side. And apparently, Luther Strange did this all night long. He was on message, and he kept saying over and over and over and over and over and over again, the president picked me, the president has endorsed me, the president likes me, he really, 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 really likes me. And it might make a difference.
It might make a difference. One of the interesting things about this race, insider dynamics, this is a race to replace Senator Jeff Sessions.
Right.
And one of the key people within the Trump administration is Rick Dearborn,
Right.
who is, I'm sure, calling some of the shots and all in on Luther Strange. And I would think, Jon Ward, that one of the things that Trump doesn't want to have is someone like Roy Moore who's going to make getting votes in the Senate even more difficult for him.
Oh, yeah, totally. And in low turnout elections, which this is going to be, I presume, I mean, it's an off-year special election. It's not going to be high turnout. So you're going to have motivated people for Moore just because that's the nature of his support. But you're going to have machine politics. And machine politics in these types of elections still matters because it's such low turnout. And so you've got Dearborn, you've got McConnell, and that's going to matter. I have a seemingly silly question that I mean in all seriousness. Do we think that Luther Strange's name costs him any support? I mean, maybe even like a more high-profile race, where there's higher numbers of voters, it would matter more. But it's such a odd name.
It's a strange name.
It's a strange name.
I think I've been wondering the same thing, although I haven't heard much to that question at all.
I think, again, if you've got just casual voters,
right,
who aren't.
I'm stifling all kinds of inappropriate comments.
Right. I bet he always is. But I think that his moniker is Big Luther, right?
Right.
And I think the president, I don't think he didn't coin that. I think somebody did, but the president's using it a lot. I think that actually might sort of take over.
Interesting.
Well, he's 6'9". He's a former basketball player for the University of Tulane. He's also a fairly well-known political figure. And part of my theory is that this has less to do with Donald Trump, although I think Trump is really going to be important. There's no doubt about it. But there are some internal dynamics of this race.
Curious. I don't know.
Well, the internal dynamics is Strange was appointed by a very unpopular former governor, or current governor, is Bentley still the governor, who got caught up in all kinds of sex scandal, and there was a lot of investigation of that governor. And so there's the dynamics that Strange was going to investigate him. Then again, some people think there might have been some sort of deal. And from my perspective, all politics is local. And if Strange is affiliated too closely with the political establishment, there's another dynamic. And Roy Moore represents really the anti-establishment within Alabama and has for quite a while. And there is an establishment that Sessions was kind of part of Senator Richard Shelby was part of, and there's also several members of Congress. And these fights have been going on within Alabama for a while. And so Strange is definitely the leader of the establishment forces within Alabama. And so we'll see what happens. To your point, John, can they overcome, can the machine overcome the populism? And I think that's the big question. And religion, obviously in Alabama, always plays a big role in any race in Alabama.
Can Sessions campaign as AG?
You can't.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's so interesting to have both McConnell and Trump so aggressively campaign for Luther Strange. Yeah. Adam, do you want to get in on this?
No, but I will offer this to our audience watching on Facebook Live. I'm trying to work on the audio. I'm doing some cutting of this video live through our Mevo camera, and it is on a wide shot. So if you two look a little bit more at the camera will help me frame these things. I'm having trouble with the wide shot with Feehery. I'll edit this out of the podcast for the taped version. You will never know that this happened. I'm sorry I did not participate in this last segment.
You got to love live television thanks to Facebook Live. And apparently you can also do it on Yahoo, which I heard from my friend Lee Dunn, who works for Google.
Yeah, no, Lee is great, and she's got some great tips, and we're listening. Thank you.
Theory 2, democracy is the worst form of government except for everything else. Here's my theory. The Republican Party is a mess. They have an unpredictable president, a House majority that can't pass gas, and a Senate majority that keeps falling one vote short. Yes, the GOP is screwed up, except for one big thing. The Democrats are worse. They find themselves in an untenable political position by their most rabid leftist wing. Bernie Sanders is pushing socialized medicine and making all of his people in the party follow that line. They find themselves on the wrong side of law enforcement and the military. They make abortion on demand a litmus test, and they drive out most gun owners in the country from their party. And right now, I don't see how they win back the House, the Senate, or the White House. This is kind of a long way, Jon Ward, to talk about your new book that you're writing.
Is there a theory here anywhere? Please, come on.
The theory is that Democrats are screwed up. You're writing a book about Ted Kennedy's primary challenge against Jimmy Carter in 1980 election, which I think a lot of people don't realize. I know you did a lot of historic research. I wanted to find a way to talk about that book. Also talk about the state of the two political parties. Yes, the Republicans are screwed up, but no one's really talking about how damaged the Democrats are right now. So first of all, tell us about your book.
Can I reverse them?
Sure.
Okay. Because I can dispatch with the...
That's very Obama of you, right?
Well,
let me take the second part of that question first.
And unpack.
Never ask a two-part question.
That's an even better piece
Never,
of advice.
just always short questions. No, but I can dispatch with the second part quickly, which is just I would plug my podcast honestly because I just interviewed Jonathan Rauch. Because when you say the Republicans can't pass anything, Democrats are in worse shape, I just kind of automatically go, where my head is at on this stuff is just that our politics are messed up because we've gotten away from institutional thinking. We've gotten away from empowering experts and parties to do their job. And I think, one way in which you see this is that when you hear people talk about how to make a difference, they either talk about, and I think there was a guy named Chance the Rapper who was on the Emmys the other night who did a political rap. People get upset when people inject politics into the Emmys. My response was, his whole point at the end was, get involved, go join a protest. And I am all in favor of civic participation from the streets to the voting booth. But if that's the extent of the way you define being involved, it's not sufficient. We need institutions like political parties that endure over time, that do the hard work through the members of Congress, through getting people elected, through writing platforms. That's the kind of participation we need. Another example would be members of the Senate don't really respect the committee process anymore, where people really get involved. You're a former staffer. They really get involved on the issues. They study them in depth. They try to figure out how the two sides, the two parties can come together to pass something. And then the senators who are not on those committees, my impression would be that in the past, they would generally defer to those committees. That doesn't happen anymore because everybody's got their own social media channel, their own fundraising. They're all sort of fractured apart. So the long game.
I think that's very interesting, especially when you think about seniority in the Senate and the things that give you stature and power are being undercut because the committee process and regular order no longer there. Personality can triumph, and really what we're heading towards here is the discussion of a primary of a sitting president, which is really an extension of the undercut of power and tenure. True?
Well, yes, and it also connects to the book.
Well, that was my point.
Yeah, thank you.
See where I was going with that?
Well, this is, I mean, the whole way I got thinking about institutions and all this stuff is by the research on the book, because I didn't study political science in college. I was a lit major. I didn't know all the history of how political parties used to choose nominees prior to 1972, because up till 1968, the convention came together, and generally the bosses got together in the back room and decided how they were going to sway the delegates, and they chose the nominee. So people react to that now because it feels undemocratic. And the name of my podcast, sorry to plug this, but
please do.
It's called The Long Game. And the only thing I'll say to wrap that part up is that Jonathan Rauch, who's at Brookings in the Atlantic, says that direct democracy is less democratic than mediated democracy. I think that's a very key point to respond to people who say, well, bosses in the back room, that's not democratic. So that's another discussion. The book, yes, I think part of the reason I wrote it is because I don't think a lot of people realize that Ted Kennedy ran for president. And it's really interesting. If you go to the Kennedy Institute in Boston, it's right next to the JFK Library. It's the size of a presidential library. It's got the ambition of a presidential library. It has a mock, down to the last detail, same size, everything else, mock Senate chamber, which is really cool. Nowhere in that building is it mentioned that he ever ran for president.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah, and so I think a lot of that traces back to Vicki Kennedy, his second wife, his widow, who's a longtime Washington lawyer, very savvy political operator. She raised a lot of the funds. She helped get public money to Bobby Kennedy doesn't have anything like that.
Right.
Because he doesn't have a Vicki Kennedy.
One of the most stirring things about that 1980 convention was when Ted Kennedy talked about the dream never dying. Mm-hmm. The dream never dies. Well, it died with Kennedy because he couldn't take out Carter, right. And that was very disappointing for the left. But the left has come back. And to your point about direct democracy and mobilization, and I want to get to your other point about dissent, John, pretty soon, but there is this idea that the only way you can actively participate in the political process, especially if you're on the left, and sometimes if you're on the right, is by protesting. Or by tearing down statues, or by doing something violent. And what we've seen, there was a study that just came out the other day where 1 in 5 college students would prefer, instead of having some sort of a principled discussion, would use violence against someone who didn't agree with them if they talked about things they didn't like.
Right.
And that's not a healthy thing for our democracy if you're going to choose violence instead of having any kind of discussion. But this is I think this has really kind of hurt the Democrats more than the Republicans. But the Tea Party was part of this too. I mean, when the Tea Party came, they were going after the establishment every bit as much as they were going after the Democrats and President Obama. And I think people misunderstood the Tea Party in the sense that everyone thought they were a bunch of racists who hated President Obama. But they hated the entire political establishment, including President Obama, but also including, John Boehner. And anyone who was from a country club. So, talk a little bit about that.
Well, I'm going to make a slightly unpolitic point about the Tea Party, because I covered the Tea Party very closely, and I think there were a lot of good people obviously involved in it. I do think, maybe a little contrary to your point, that race was, I actually think race, from my perception, race came in a little, I don't know. It's hard to say, but I do think it was a factor for a lot of people, even if it was
it just wasn't as prominent in the rhetoric at the beginning, right? It was everything else but that.
Well, it was
a common denominator that people weren't talking about. Maybe
they'd have signs with Obama, and all kinds of different things, and there were racists within that movement. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, and then the birther thing. Anyway,
Well, yeah.
My general read on the what's undeniably true is that a lot of these people that I talked to at rallies at the time, the Glenn Beck rally, other rallies, were people that had not been involved in politics, and I think generally they were people who had grown up during the post-war era, and they had had a good life. You know, they had had a stable job and income, and they had raised their kids, and they were the beneficiaries of a unique period in human history. And so things started to unravel in '08 with the
Right.
economic crisis, and they had not been politically involved and were a little politically naive and said, well, we're going to get involved and change things. And there's definitely, it's good when people get involved, but there was a sense of just throw the bumps out.
What's the status of the Tea Party right now in your estimation?
I don't know. Maybe they've split into kind of a Ted Cruz wing. I wouldn't say he's the leader of it, but he represents sort of that religiously tinged, religious right type. And then there's the more, populist wing, which would be the Trump wing.
Right.
But I don't hear a lot of talk of that label.
Of that label.
Yeah.
I think that label is pretty much obsolete for the
Yeah.
most part.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, there's a theory about what caused the French Revolution, and that is the theory having to do with people had things good, and then
Yeah.
the collapse of expectations really causes revolution, and that's what happened. What I always called it the suburban revolutionaries. Everything was going fine in the suburbs, and then all of a sudden you had all these houses being foreclosed on.
Yeah.
You couldn't pay for your roads, and then people got pissed,
Right.
and that's what caused this.
And they drew a correlation between their inability. A lot of these people were over leveraged.
Over leverage, right?
Right? They had taken out a second or third or fourth loan on their home to buy a boat,
Right.
or a second car, or whatever, which was not responsible on their part,
Right.
but it was also encouraged by the lending sector. And they looked at their life and they looked at the government, and that's why there was talk about debt at the time. It was also an issue, obviously, but they looked at their being over leveraged, and they looked at the government. They said the government's over leveraged, and we've got to get that under control.
So one of the things about the French Revolution is it was overcome by Napoleon. And that's what I think of as Trump. He's kind of like a Napoleon in the sense that he's marching in, he's taking all their fury. And there is a Ted Cruz wing, but it's not the dominant wing. It's now Trump runs everything. And people have a lot of faith in Trump, going back to our original theory about Trump having a lot of the Christian right unexpectedly likes this guy because he's willing to be politically incorrect and really willing to stand up for what they perceive to be American values and American borders, which I think is a unique place. John, I want to just turn to you a little bit about, because Jon Ward brought up another very interesting point about the Senate and the lack of going through the committees of jurisdiction. How about Lindsey Graham coming up with a Senate bill with John Cassidy? Right? I mean, what's up with that? They're not even on the committees of jurisdiction. How does that happen? And they might be able to pass this thing.
Opportunity, and I think just pure will to do something. And Lindsey Graham, I'm a big fan because he's there to do something, and he's there to speak his mind. And I've always really appreciated, he's also a really smart guy that works his tail off, cares deeply about the institution of the Senate, cares deeply about his party, but also, I also know that he was on the phone with President Obama a lot, trying to figure out how to maybe get something done.
And then President Trump.
And President Trump, and before President Obama,
Yeah.
George W. Bush.
Right.
I mean, it's been all of them.
Right.
And that's the kind of high-level operator Lindsey Graham is. So if he sees an opportunity and he sees a place where he can help, that's what he did. But I think to John's earlier point, I obviously agree. I've watched a lot of committee hearings, participated in a few as a staff member. But there's just so much grandstanding going on right now. And if you look at the floor, I once upon a time worked for Senator Packwood, and where there was a time when there was actual debates and real live discussions on the Senate floor. And we're not going to return to that probably for a while, if ever. But to John's point about sort of that interaction and that debate and that discussion and getting involved, that existed on the Senate floor too, where they could actually have Republicans and Democrats were going back and forth, even Republicans and Republicans, disagreeing but trying to hash it out on the floor. Same with committee. And it is a shame that because of social media, I think, and clickbait and trying to go to committee because I'm going to say something and we're going to tweet it out right away. Or we're going to put it on Facebook right away, and I'm going to get all these likes, and we're going to further my fundraising.
Right.
There is a lot of that. I don't want to disparage everybody in the Senate because there are so many good, hardworking people in the Senate that are studying for those committee hearings. They've got binders for those committee hearings. They want to ask the right questions. They want to raise the right issues.
But the incentives
That's right.
are really bad.
The incentives are very bad.
Yeah.
But
And that's true in journalism too, by the way.
I think that's exactly right.
That's
I mean,
another podcast.
Well, we had another podcast talking about journalism. We can have you back. I will say, though, that I'm fascinated by the fact that they're going to pass this thing without any committee hearings, without really any kind of legislative hearings. I think that McConnell's scheduled a vote, and he's going to get 50 votes. What happens in the House? Do they pass this thing in the
They are
House?
doing a Senate hearing on Monday, I believe, and that's
That's because Graham absolutely positively had to.
it was McCain.
Yeah, he had to cede to McCain, and they had to get. Now, I don't know that one hearing is sufficient to tackle Senator McCain's concerns about conceiving this in darkness, and I also don't think that it will be enough to bring him along. And I think basically we've been talking around that, right? There are.
Well, let's
there's
predict.
one
Let's,
vote you're not going to get.
let's make a prediction.
Okay.
Do you think this passes next week? Senator Belmar.
I think it does. I think it passes in the Senate.
With McCain's vote.
No, I don't think so.
Well, how do they do without McCain?
Right.
They get Rand Paul? He's on the hot seat.
Yeah, no, I may have just made a mistake, but
Well, Rand's a no because it doesn't fully repeal.
He's a no because Obamacare is secretly popular in his state.
Maybe Adam knows something about Susan Collins that we don't.
Well, listen, I went back and read the president's State of the Union address over the last couple days, and he laid some very clear principles there for what repeal and replace had to do, and one of the cornerstones of that was protecting people with pre-existing conditions, right? And there are real questions about what this bill does and who it protects, and there's a lot of contentious argument about whether the number of people who will lose insurance constitutes, going back on this principle. And what you hear most often is that people are going to be losing their insurance because of what's going on under Obamacare anyway.
Let's do the math though. They need one of four, right?
Right.
McCain, Collins, Murkowski, and Rand. Is
Yeah.
that right?
Correct.
So maybe they get Collins because before there was Graham Cassidy, there was Collins Cassidy.
Well,
I mean,
Collins
that's-
also was out this week talking to ABC News about leaving the door open. She said that she's not,
Right.
she's leaning no, but she's open to this bill, and
So that's a long yes.
yeah.
So you're yes. Jon Ward, do you think they're going to
I
pass this?
said yes right off the
Yeah.
bat.
It seemed
Okay.
just from I haven't studied this issue closely in the last week or two. So
That doesn't matter.
I don't. So I don't know exactly.
We'll get to NFL picks next.
I don't know exactly where Collins is. If they can get Collins, then I guess it passes. But I don't know enough about where she's at.
Our noted Senate expert, John Easton, do you think this passes?
No, because to our discussion here about the votes, I don't think they have Collins or Rand. I think they are pretty solid no's. They can afford to lose those two, but they would need McCain or Murkowski. I would give McCain maybe slightly better than 50-50 that he'll vote for it. I don't think they have Murkowski. So I'm a no. John?
Well, but if you said that McCain's vote is a better than 50% chance, then you actually do think it's better than 50% chance of passing.
No, because they can't lose Murkowski.
Oh, they need two of those four,
Yes. They need two of those four,
even with Pence.
even with Pence.
Yeah, okay.
That only gets you to 49.
Okay.
So my theory on this is that, even though it's not part of the original theories, is it does pass, and it goes to the House. The House picks it up and passes, sends it to the president, and then it becomes a real problem. And then they've got to come and fix it next year, because otherwise all hell's going to break loose. Theory 3, baseball, hot dogs, apple pie, and Chevrolet. Here's my theory. Kids shouldn't be forced to choose one sport over another until they reach high school. The rise of travel teams puts too much pressure on kids, too much pressure on parents, and is having a negative impact on neighborhoods and kids who may want to play and continue to play sports they aren't as good as or don't have parental support to do travel teams. We all have kids who play sports. John Easton, you coach softball. John, you coach your son's Little League. Adam, one of your sons is a great soccer player. The other one
Is an actor.
is a great actor, and we'll talk about that in a couple seconds. John Easton, what's your thought on the rise of travel teams? And talk a little bit about kids' sports and the importance that all kids participate in sports.
I think I'm a beneficiary of participating in sports when I was growing up, and I think there are just so many benefits. I played 3 sports, different sports, that is, and now what's happening, of course, is a lot of kids are just playing one sport, and there's this rise of 2 seasons a year. I mean, I coach 2 seasons a year for my daughter's softball team. It used to be there was just one season. So the travel teams, of course, are, well, that's just more, and you get on a better team, and you keep playing, and I think it's, you have a lot of coaches out there, professional coaches, who say that it actually is better for athletes, for young athletes, to play multiple sports. Mm-hmm. It's better for their bodies, it's better for their muscles, and it's better for longevity of playing sports. And the trend is to go one sport, because if you're not playing 2 seasons, let's say, of one sport, you're actually falling behind a little bit of those who are playing 2 sports. Then the travel teams. If you're not on a travel team, then maybe you're falling behind in that sport because you're not on that travel team. It just one begets another, and it's just that trend is strong.
So, John, your son is now in Little League. He's about 8 years old?
He turns 10.
10 turns. Oh, sorry about that. You're going to see this because my son is 11, going to turn 12. There's already pressure for us because he plays both in the spring and fall, baseball and soccer. And there's a lot of pressure on which one he needs to do, and I don't know what the hell to do. Yeah. But what are your thoughts on kids' sports? You have 5 children.
4 girls.
4 girls,
yeah.
And I'll tell you what that means to me. That means Title IX, baby.
Yes.
You know all about Title IX. I used to be against Title IX until I had a daughter. Now I'm all for it.
It also means 4 weddings.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
I have 3 girls.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on the kids' sports?
Well, I think there's room for nuance. I don't think we need to say categorically that travel sports are, totally bad. But I had a friend his kids were older. This was a couple of years ago. Who was just complaining about how far flung their family was and how much money they had to spend, and it sounded awful. And he actually pulled his kids back from that. But to me, sports. One of the primary things they do is teach kids about life and character, and I think we've kind of gotten out of balance on that. I think it's that I do think the Capitol Hill Little League here on the Hill does a good job.
I do too. I agree with that.
Talking about that, and I love it for that. And I think when you get into travel sports, first of all, most of these kids are not going to play professionally. Some of them might play collegiately, but the way people kind of approach it just seems off because the investment they're putting into it is the kind of investment you put into career training, something you think is going to work out long term. Whereas the main thing that's going to work out long term is the character these kids learn from it, and
right.
You don't need to have a travel team to do that.
Right, I agree with that. I will say that for many parents, including me, and I'm terrible, so I get it. This is my form of entertainment. I love watching kids' sports. I love watching my kid play sports.
Yeah.
I love everything about it. I love watching my little girl.
I get a little too worked up sometimes.
If you coach, it helps because you actually cannot get as worked up as a coach.
Right, I think that's right. And what I found is when I yell at my son, which I don't do anymore, but when I used to, it would be very counterproductive.
Yeah.
Very counterproductive. And I will say that I'm managing my son's team. I know, John, you're one of the best softball managers out there. The parents on the Capitol Hill are pretty good.
Yeah.
But I've heard horror stories, and I've written about horror stories. Adam, talking about your son, who's a big soccer player in Virginia.
I appreciate everything that Jon Ward has said because we finally made that transition this season. For my youngest son, Sam, who's now 13, we held him back when he was younger. So he's rather old or older in his 7th grade year. He's playing up in a U14 league. But it's travel. And you know what? When you have 2 kids or 5 kids or multiple kids and you're it's divide and conquer, right? The family is just strewn across the area every weekend. And my ex-wife and I and we would just cooperate as best as we possibly can on taking the boys wherever they need to be. It's a real challenge. My weekend, her weekend, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
We've got to put everything we have into this to get the boys to where they need to be to do all this. And in the end, when we're trying to emphasize homework and the scholastics, and they want to have that honor roll and that A, it's getting harder and harder because the practices eat up so much time every night, and they're getting home late. And, we want them to learn the character issues. I tell you, I've never seen my sons learn more about themselves or being a part of a team than when they lose. Because it begins to dawn on them that the differentiator was, we're not together. We're not talking on the field the way that we should, and we can do better if we come. And you know what? I love that. And they love it, and they learn from it. But when they're exhausted and they can't do everything at once, and we can't support them as parents, it is.
I will say one of the things that helps kids with losing is when you give them cookies after the game.
As I've become an adult and a coach and a father, losing has taken on so much more significance, because that's where you learn the character. That's where you learn how to deal with adversity.
But and that's true with any activity that they're getting involved, any extracurricular activity they're getting involved with, theater, debate,
failure,
but also working together with whether it's your classmates or your teammates. It's all good. And I remember growing up, my father was my basketball coach from the 5th grade through the 8th grade, and I remember driving back with him from games, and I had the scorebook out. We were going through everything. It was a complete bonding experience.
Yeah, that's cool.
Whether it's a sport or whether it is another activity, a non-athletic activity, they're all really important. But them doing stuff after school and on the weekends is just really, really important.
I really like that comment, and I'm glad to know that was a bonding experience for you and your father.
Yeah.
We try to do that. I'm not the coach of the team. I'm obviously a lot more knowledgeable and smarter than any coach he's ever had. I always tell him that. But we try and deconstruct the game.
I want to say a couple quick things. First of all, Adam has the Redskins hat on, which, are you a Redskins fan, being a University of Maryland guy?
I lost interest in the NFL quite a while ago.
And I think that's interesting because...
that was the only correct way to answer the "Are you a Redskins fan?" You're disavowed from the NFL award altogether.
It's true. If I was still interested in watching NFL football, I would still root for them.
So I think that's interesting. And I think it's interesting talking about youth sports because there's a huge movement in some circles away from kids playing football, which I think is bad for the NFL. And there's no way my wife's going to let my son play football, even though he probably wants to.
Yeah, my son's been bugging me to do it.
Yeah, but I also think you can go to, in this area, there's not a whole lot of places for kids to play football.
Right.
But you go out in the suburbs, the kids are still playing football.
Right.
But the trends show that the trend line is way down on football because it's really a sport where you can get yourself in big trouble.
Yeah. I was telling somebody this morning, I used to take pictures of my helmet when I was like 11, 12. I was so proud of all the gashes in it because I used to hit with my head.
Yeah.
And
I
stopped.
We were kind of taught to do that.
Yeah, I guess we were. I can't remember. I didn't listen to my coaches.
But I think that football, you're right. I played football all the way through high school, loved every second of it. But the concussion rate in soccer, especially with girls soccer,
is that
it's
completely
high
because of headers?
It's all that incidental contact. There's a ton of it.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, and I think it gets overshadowed by football. Obviously, it's a big problem, and now you're having these issues post NFL career issues, and that's getting a lot of ink too. So we'll see where this goes, but it's a great sport. I loved it.
It is a great sport. My dad wouldn't let me play football till my senior year, so as it turned out, I was actually really bad at football, but I did play, and I got I got beat up.
You got your bell rung?
Exactly. I think there's still a problem right now. So turning to sports, and I want to shout out to one of the Belmar boys who is a lead actor in a new play. Could you tell us about it?
We're very excited. Our oldest son, Maxwell Belmar, has been pursuing his love of creativity in the arts, and he's been an actor for some time. And as a freshman at Jeb Stuart High School in Fairfax, he went out
Is it still Jeb Stuart?
For right now, it is. We'll just call it Stuart High School. And he went out for the play, and he's got a lead as a freshman in this play. And he's very excited because he's getting to meet new people, and it really sort of has that feedback loop of the work you're doing is paying off. You've got a presence, and I think he's going to do a great job. They're doing a play called The Government Inspector, which is a very old play that was written by a Russian author back in the 1850s. It transcends a lot of great topics, and it's a very humorous play. And so we're excited about that. But it's not always just sports.
Well, I think that gets to my point. I mean, we could spend some of the money that we do sports for kids to do acting or plays or something like that. They'd actually probably do better in the workforce.
Yeah.
You know, I think
They learn a lot about themselves when they do
Well,
that.
just the ability to give and present in front of a crowd becomes very marketable, especially when you're talking more about the creative economy or playing music. I know that your daughters are in the orchestra. My son's in the orchestra. That becomes actually really important because it's for math, for a lot of other things. I mean, it would be nice to have that kind of investment in that part of the brain as well, not just sports.
Yeah, and I as a right brain guy, I think I'm more right brain, which is I think the creative side. I just think it's good for your human happiness and flourishing. Just to counter your more Randian.
Not Rand Paul, Randian. I get that.
Right.
Well, thank you so much for Jon Ward. I want to make a special shout out to our State Farm representative, Tim Lacasse. Do you have that copy of that? Do you have that pen? He gave us pens today.
He does,
He's
yeah.
our local merchant that we want to highlight today.
Right, and if you get a policy with them, you get a pen that is beautiful. Anyway, it's www.insuremetim.com.
Well, hey, while we're doing shout-outs, can I just...
too.
We had an opportunity this week. Some friends at the NCTA and Fox, 20th Century Fox, invited us to a screening of a just amazing cinematic force, Kingsman: The Golden Circle. Anybody out there who watched the first Kingsman movie? You guys go ahead and laugh. I love the movie. It was tremendous. And then the sequel, wow. It's a hell of a ride. We went. I recommend it.
It's a hell of a ride. I do not recommend it if you care about deep storylines. But
No, not the storylines, but it was really a lot of fun and was really good. Thank you.
I have a shout out.
go for it, John.
Yeah, I do root for Maryland football, and they're having a good year. It's the 125th, well, so far, 2 games in, 125th anniversary of Maryland football. And my grandfather, we do have football in our veins, was an All-American, consensus All-American lineman at the University of Maryland in the early 50s. Passed away 12 years ago, but that's sort of our heritage.
Wow.
Yeah.
Right.
Go Terps.
Yeah.
Go Terps.
Yeah, they play Central Florida this week, but I know they've got Ohio State coming up.
And John, who does Oregon play?
Oregon plays Arizona State. They're 3-0, but the Pac-12 season starts in earnest, so it's going to get tougher from here.
And as you know, the Irish play Michigan State, 8 o'clock on Saturday night. Thank you for listening to the Feehery Theory Podcast, simulcast on Facebook Live. This podcast has been brought to you by EFB Advocacy. EFB means...
Excellent for business.
Yes.
No, yeah, baby.